Welcome to the Yemen Brief Podcast, the place to turn for informed insight about what's happening in Yemen. This podcast is brought to you by the team at the Center for Strategic Studies. I'm AbuBakr al-Shamahi, a researcher at the Center, and your host for today's episode of our ongoing series discussing Yemen with experts and interesting individuals from the country and around the world. Tension between Iran and Saudi Arabia has been a mainstay of the Middle East for decades. The Cold War, so to speak, between the two countries has led to adversarial involvements in conflicts across the region. In Yemen, Iran backs the Houthi rebels, while Saudi Arabia is an active participant in the war on the side of the Yemeni government. It's quite clear that the involvement of the two countries has exacerbated the conflict on the ground. But is there any chance of a rapprochement? Saudi Arabia and Iran have held talks this year both before and after Ibrahim Raisi became Iranian president in August. Has anything changed? And what would that mean for Yemen and the wider Middle East? I'm joined today by Adnan Tabatabai, an Iran analyst who's the co-founder and CEO of the Germany-based CARPO Research Institute. His analysis piece, The View from Iran After Raisi's Election, can be found on our website, sanacenter.org. Thanks for joining us, Adnan. Now let's jump straight into the topic. In light of these talks that have been ongoing throughout 2021, what's the current state of relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran? Are they actually improving at all?
Well, thanks for having me. I guess what we are currently seeing is a cautious move towards some sort of, let's say, de-escalation first, as a first step. We have obviously always had some sort of contact between the security apparatuses of both countries, but these talks had never been publicly confirmed or in any shape or form talked about. What is important this year is that it has become public. Neither side is denying it. And currently, the Iranian side sounds a bit more confident about the progress made in these talks compared to the Saudi side. But I guess that's in the nature of how these countries currently see themselves in their regional posture in the Middle East. But all in all, I think it's very positive that there are talks and that they are continuing. So I'm a bit hopeful, in fact, that something positive can come out of it.
What do both sides hope to gain from these talks? You've said that they decided to go public with them, but what's in it for each side? What they actually want from each other?
I guess for the Saudi side, what's in it is that they get some sort of help from Iran for a face-saving exit out of Yemen. Obviously, Iran cannot end the war in Yemen, but in functional talks with Iran, potentially the regional dimension of the war in Yemen can in one way or another be closer to being resolved. So I guess this is the main demand from Saudi Arabia, alleviating concerns about the threat posed by the Houthis on Saudi Arabia and on Saudi soil. I guess that the Saudis will also demand from Tehran that no group in Iraq or elsewhere will launch any sort of attack against Saudi Arabia. For Iran, I think what's in it is that Saudi Arabia stops asking the US for more pressure to be imposed on Iran for the JCPOA not to be continued. I'm referring to the nuclear agreement. And then there are lots of regional interests that Iran has where Saudi Arabia could be of help, or at least not be an actor that tries to undermine Iranian interests. There are different contexts we could talk about, but I guess the most important issues are Yemen on the one hand. I guess Syria and Iraq are also important. So I think these three contexts are the ones that these two sides are talking about.
Well, this is the Yemen Brief, so let's dive into Yemen. How could any rapprochement between Saudi and Iran actually impact Yemen?
I guess what is really important is that, and I wouldn't be able to answer it, but what we need is a realistic assessment of how much the Iranians really have been enabling the Houthis to fight back against Saudi Arabia. So is there in any shape or form the possibility that if Iran tomorrow decides that it wants to ask the Houthis to halt attacks against Saudi Arabia, will the Houthis listen to Iran? Or do they have at a certain point their own agenda, which is basically because of the conflict that they have with Saudi Arabia, their own calculations about the Yemen conflict. And I think at a certain point, Iran is no longer going to be able to exert some influence on the Houthis. Having said that, I guess for Iran, it can be a role that is ascribed to Iran to really try and encourage the Houthis that should they be less demanding in some talks with the Saudis on a ceasefire, to convince the Saudis that the Houthis have to play a role in the political future of Yemen. I think this type of de-escalating influence Iran could play. But again, I think this is a definition on there's a definition needed on how far Iran's influence really reaches into the Houthi thinking.
That's been something quite difficult for observers to find out, or to understand the level of Iranian influence over the Houthi movements in Yemen. I know you said that this was obviously hard, but from your understanding, what's the relationship like between the two?
First of all, I think what we should appreciate or acknowledge is the fact that the relationship has intensified with the duration of the war. So the longer the war has been going on, the more Iran's influence on the Houthis took shape. And obviously, Iran is explicit about its political support. It is at times also explicit about strategic, if not military support. But particularly that military support is extremely difficult to verify and to measure, because a lot of it happens through informal channels. A lot of it does not simply happen by supplying the Houthis with weaponry, but with kits of how to put together a rocket, or of how to put together a missile. And this is not necessarily a package that they would receive coming from Iran, but that package, if we want to call it that, may also come from different militant groups, be it in Iraq. There has been reports about these kits, if you will, being received from Lebanon. So there is an informal trade avenue, an informal route that is really difficult to detect and to decode where the supply for the Houthis comes from, and that this type of, let's call it euphemistically, capacity building that Iran has been operating with the Houthis has in fact enabled them to develop some of their militants' capabilities that wouldn't stop to be there should Iran tomorrow stop supporting the Houthis. So this is why I would say it's difficult to really assess what impact would it have on the combating capabilities of the Houthis if Iran were to decide tomorrow that they want to ask them to stop fighting. And this is really what I guess is difficult for us as observers without access to intelligence and some satellite imagery to really understand how deep the involvement of Iran really goes.
Let's zoom out just a little bit. How much tension does this, and I've called it a Cold War before, obviously not the first one to do that, between Saudi Arabia and Iran, how much tension does that create across the region, not just in Yemen?
As a general answer, I would start by saying that I don't think that the Iran-Saudi Cold War or tensions initiate any conflict, but they can be part of an existent conflict at some point. So if we see something happening in Lebanon, in Bahrain, in Syria, Iraq, or we're speaking about Yemen, then there might at some point be an Iran-Saudi dimension to it. With Yemen being a neighboring country to Saudi Arabia, that obviously is of high importance in the Yemen context, so that the Iran-Saudi Arabia tensions play out extraordinarily in that conflict, obviously. But I would say if tomorrow Iran and Saudi Arabia were to find a solution for their geopolitical rivalry, this will not lead to peace everywhere in the region. And it will also probably not lead to peace in Yemen's internal conflict, but at least it would alleviate some of the regional dimensions of the conflict. And the last thing I would want to add is I guess we are in a situation in the region that you cannot separate one single context from the others. You can no longer just discuss Yemen. You will also have to discuss a bit of Syria, a bit of Iraq, maybe a bit of Afghanistan. So this is what I also believe is happening between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And this is what we should look into. What are the trade-offs, maybe? What are the transactional agreements these two countries come up with?
Yeah, events in the region are obviously integrated with each other, like you said. But how do internal politics in a country like Iran affect the region as well? In Iran, there's a new president, Ibrahim Raisi. Does this mean that Iranian policies towards Saudi Arabia could change? And this constant cycle of tension, followed by talks, followed by tension, is this just something that's going to likely continue between Iran and Saudi Arabia? Or are they perhaps able to put these issues behind them in the long term, while still maintaining their separate and divergent ideologies?
Let's for a second, and for the sake of our discussion, think about India, Pakistan as neighbors and Germany and France as neighbors. So the ideal scenario of powerhouses in the region would obviously be the German-French relations, which has turned from rivalry to friendship. But obviously the whole neighborhood of both countries has been super conducive for these two big countries to have extremely peaceful and good relations. Whereas with India and Pakistan, you see no armed conflict, but you still see tensions, which, however, means that this is also a relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia that could be seen as, as a potential model for their relations. There is no proxy wars going on. There is no armed conflict, but at least there are some tensions. I think this will very much depend on the neighborhood of both countries. Will other countries around Iran and Saudi Arabia actually push both countries into becoming friends, or will there be some actors benefiting from this tension between Iran and Saudi Arabia? So this will be something we should look at. In terms of how Iranian factions see the region, I think we cannot necessarily define this through factional lines. What I would rather see is the overall situation of the Islamic Republic of Iran that defines whether it wants to seek outreach and detente with its neighborhood. And I would just say one point here, and that is the necessity to diversify routes of trade for Iran. So the necessity to circumvent sanctions, the necessity to develop regional ties and economic integration is something that you can literally see and hear in the statements of officials. I guess this is why, to me, this current Iranian approach of outreach to the Saudis makes sense, because it is really part of the attempt to diversify trade relations in its immediate neighborhood. And I guess if that is part of the incentive for Iran to seek ties with or to seek better relations with Saudi Arabia, that can be sustainable. And I hope, obviously, it will materialize.
Yes, I think that whatever happens, the relationship between the two will be hugely vital for both Yemen and the wider region. Thank you so much for joining us today, Adnan. A really, really interesting and illuminating conversation with you. And thank you to the audience for listening. This podcast is part of the Sana'a Center program examining the roles of state and non-state foreign actors in Yemen. You can find us online at sana'acenter.org or on Facebook or Twitter.